All right, let's go. Number 10. Mitochondrial Eve, and the thread is thinner than anyone expected. In 1987, geneticist Rebecca Cann and her colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley were mapping mitochondrial DNA collected from women across 5 continents when the data pointed somewhere no one was fully prepared to go. The samples, drawn from placentas, carefully catalogued, run through comparative mutation analysis, all converged on a single ancestral woman. One woman. In Africa. Roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. The physical evidence here is not a bone or a carved tool. It is a pattern inside living cells, written in the mitochondrial DNA, that passes unchanged from mother to child, accumulating small mutations at a measurable rate over generations. Cann's team counted those mutations across hundreds of samples and worked the clock backward, tracing every branching line until the branches ran out. The African root was the deepest, the oldest. And it led to one woman, not because she was the only woman alive, but because her female line, and only her line, survived unbroken to the present day. That single fact, cold and statistical, is the staggering one. Every mother alive today is her descendant. The textbook picture before this said human diversity was ancient, broad, and layered. Different populations developing in parallel across the old world over 1 million years or more. Cann's mitochondrial data cut against that picture sharply. It placed the common root far more recently and far more narrowly than the consensus had assumed. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Tracing back to one woman does not mean the population was healthy. Geneticist Vanessa Hayes and her team at the Garvan Institute of Medical Research analyzed mitochondrial DNA mutation rates and found evidence that around 195,000 years ago, a severe African drought lasting tens of thousands of years may have forced the entire Homo sapiens population into a small refuge near the southern African coast, possibly the Magadik-Gadi-Okavango region of what is now Botswana. The population that came through that period may have been extraordinarily small. Some researchers argue it numbered only in the hundreds or low thousands. Mainstream archaeology regards this specific refugium claim as plausible but not yet conclusively established, and debate continues over the precise location and duration of that bottleneck. This means the closeness of the Eve line is not an artifact of good luck. It is a scar. Repeated prehistoric bottlenecks, drought, cold, disease, resource collapse, stripped away lineages that had been growing for generations, leaving the surviving threads pulled so tight that modern human genetic diversity is measurably lower than the diversity found among chimpanzees living within a single national park in Uganda's Bwindi impenetrable forest. One population, one park. More variation than the entire human species spread across 7 billion people. The numbers make that claim feel impossible. They are not. The genetic record confirms it. The last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago pressed the species again, locking so much water into continental ice sheets that global sea levels fell roughly 120 meters, turning coastal shelves into dry land where people may have sheltered, farmed, and died. Land now swallowed by ocean, its evidence gone. Each compression left the surviving gene pool narrower and the surviving lineage closer to extinction than most people imagine when they think about deep human prehistory. The truly unsettling aspect is how recently and how repeatedly the species nearly wasn't here at all, not in the abstract sense of evolutionary chance, but in the specific sense that a handful of survivors in a drought-stricken coastal refuge held every future human being in their small group without knowing it. The laboratories at Berkeley still hold the original data. Mitochondrial Eve is still the name researchers use, even knowing she was not alone. What remains unresolved is not who she was, but how many times the line connecting her to the present nearly went dark before anyone was alive to ask. Number 9. Blombos Cave beads, and the mystery of why a dying species made jewelry. In 1991, Christopher Henshelwood of the University of Bergen began excavating a small limestone cave above the Indian Ocean on South Africa's southern coast. The site was Blombos Cave, tucked into a cliff face near the town of Still Bay. What his team pulled from that rock was not a weapon or a food cache. It was decoration. The objects are tiny. Each one is a tick shell, a Nassarius kraussianus barely 5 millimeters across, pierced through the center and stained with red ochre. Henshelwood's team recovered dozens of these shells across excavation seasons, arranged in patterns consistent with stringing, suggesting they were worn together as a single piece of adornment. The cave also held flat pieces of ochre engraved with deliberate geometric crosshatch patterns, scored with a fine point. Repeated, precise. Dating places these objects at least 75,000 years ago. That number deserves a pause. 75,000 years. Alongside the beads and engraved ochre, researchers working at nearby sites filled in more of the same picture. At Pinnacle Point on the same South African coastline, Curtis Marian of Arizona State University found evidence dating to around 74,000 years ago that coastal people had survived catastrophe by harvesting shellfish from the shore, a famine refuge that no inland population could reach. At Sibudu Cave in KwaZulu-Natal, Lynn Wadley of the University of the Witwatersrand identified compound adhesives made from ochre mixed with plant resin dating to roughly 70,000 years ago. Tools that required planning, memory, and the deliberate passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. The South African coast in this period was not simply a refuge, it was a workshop. The textbook timeline before these excavations accumulated their weight placed symbolic behavior, art, personal ornament, abstract thinking, firmly in the European Upper Paleolithic, around 40,000 years ago. The received story was that something switched on in the human brain, a cognitive revolution, somewhere over the Mediterranean. Africa was largely left out of that narrative. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The Blombos beads predate that supposed European awakening by more than 30,000 years, and they appear not in a moment of comfort or abundance, but in the shadow of one of the most violent environmental events in human prehistory. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano in what is now Sumatra erupted with a force that blanketed much of the globe in ash and may have driven the entire human population down to a few thousand individuals, perhaps far fewer. Some researchers argue the genetic signal of that near extinction is still visible in DNA studies, though the exact severity of the Toba bottleneck remains actively debated among population geneticists. What is not debated is that the population was desperately small. These bead makers were not a thriving civilization, they were a remnant. This means the question is not whether symbolic thought existed before Europe. It plainly did. The harder question is what it was for. A shell bead communicates identity. It signals group membership, status, alliance, the kind of social information that lets scattered survivors recognize each other as kin rather than threat. The compound adhesives at Sibudu Cave carry the same implication on a practical register. They required a formula held in shared memory, transmitted deliberately, cultural knowledge treated as a tool no less essential than the blade it attached to. Under maximum pressure, these populations were not abandoning complexity. They were investing in it. The Y chromosome evidence adds one more dimension. Research by Monica Carmen at the University of Tartu identified a separate and severe bottleneck roughly 7,000 years ago that reduced male lineages so drastically that one man's Y chromosome eventually came to dominate 40% of Asian male populations. Humans, it appears, have survived multiple near collapses, each one leaving a scar in the genome. What makes this particularly haunting is that the beads came first, before the numbers recovered, before the population spread again. Someone picked up a small shell, pierced it, threaded it, and wore it. Blombos Cave is still there above the same ocean. The ochre staining on those shells is still visible under laboratory light. What remains unresolved is not whether these people thought symbolically. It is what those symbols meant to people who had almost no one left to show them to. Number 8. The Toba eruption, and the narrowest moment in human history. In 1993, Stanley Ambrose, a researcher at the University of Illinois, was studying genetic diversity patterns in modern human populations when a disturbing convergence appeared in the data. The numbers kept pointing backward toward a single catastrophic window roughly 74,000 years ago, when the genetic record of an entire species seemed to compress almost to nothing. The site at the center of this compression is Lake Toba in northern Sumatra, Indonesia. The lake itself is vast, roughly 100 kilometers long, but it is not a lake in the ordinary sense. It is a caldera, the flooded remnant of a supervolcano that erupted with a force no human instrument has ever recorded in the modern era. Around 74,000 years ago, that volcano released approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. That number is difficult to hold in the mind. It is the largest volcanic event documented in the past 2 million years, and the ash layer it deposited has been found in sediment cores across India, the Arabian Sea, and East Africa, forming a pale geological scar that geologists can trace across half the world. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica preserve what came next. The atmospheric record embedded in that ancient ice shows a sharp temperature drop of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius across the northern hemisphere, sustained for up to a decade. Crops, if any existed, would have failed. Forests would have thinned. The prey animals that human hunters depended upon would have followed the vegetation into decline. The world grew cold, gray, and quiet in a way that left a mark in ice that scientists can still read today. Genetic modeling, the kind Ambrose and subsequent researchers developed from mitochondrial DNA patterns, produced an estimate that some researchers argue represents the true consequence of this event. Those models suggest Homo sapiens may have been reduced to as few as 10,000 surviving individuals. 10,000 people, a population smaller than many present-day villages scattered across a continent, holding the entire biological future of the species between them and the dark. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Stone tools found above and below the Toba ash layer at sites in southern India suggest that some regional populations barely noticed the eruption. They kept making tools in the same way, using the same materials across the ash boundary without apparent disruption. This is not a minor footnote. If the eruption truly drove a global near extinction, those tools should not be there. Some researchers argue the genetic bottleneck and the Toba eruption are simply coincidental, that the timing is suggestive but not causal. Mainstream archaeology has not reached a settled verdict. The bottleneck model remains controversial, and the Indian tool evidence is genuinely difficult to reconcile with a species-wide collapse. This means the honest picture is not a clean disaster narrative. It is something stranger and more unsettling. A species that may have nearly vanished but did not do so uniformly. Geography mattered enormously, as researchers now argue that African populations sheltered in refugia with access to coastlines and diverse food sources may have fared far better than groups further north, surviving not through superior strength or intelligence, but through the accident of where they happened to be standing when the sky changed color. The truly unsettling aspect is what the bottleneck, if real, would mean for everything that came after. Every language spoken today, every story ever written, every city ever built, all of it, descended from a group of survivors so small that in demographic terms they barely registered as a population at all. The ash from Toba is still there, locked in sediment layers beneath the Indian Ocean and across the African interior. The genetic shadow of that ancient compression is still present in human DNA, carried quietly inside every person alive. What remains unresolved is whether the species survived Toba through resilience, through refuge, or simply through the oldest mechanism in natural history, The indifferent luck of being in the right place when the world went dark. Number 7. Jwalapuram survivors, where luck decided everything. In 2007, archaeologist Michael Petraglia and his team from the University of Oxford were excavating a dry riverbed at Jwalapuram in the Kurnool district of Andhra Pradesh, India, when they reached a layer of pale gray powder roughly 2.5 centimeters thick. That powder was volcanic ash. Specifically, it was the identifiable deposit of the Toba supervolcano eruption dated to approximately 74,000 years ago, one of the largest single volcanic events in Earth's last 2 million years. The find was immediate. Stone tools lay on both sides of that ash. Below the ash, tools. Above the ash, tools. The hands that made them were by the evidence of the sediment, almost certainly human. Petraglia's team recovered hundreds of small, flaked stone implements from the Jwalapuram site, and the technical style of the tools above and below the ash layer was, according to the research team, strikingly similar, suggesting the same population, or a closely related one, persisted through or immediately around the eruption event at that precise location in South Asia. Before this discovery, the dominant model was relatively clean. Toba had caused a dramatic global winter, the argument went, collapsing human populations back to a small remnant group in Africa, and it was from that desperate African refuge that the entire species eventually rebuilt. South Asia, in this picture, was effectively emptied. The subcontinent was treated as a casualty, not a refuge. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. If the Jwalapuram tools are correctly attributed and correctly dated, and mainstream archaeology continues to debate both points, then human populations were present in India before Toba and were still leaving stone tools in the same place after it. This means the bottleneck story, the single African refuge story, becomes considerably harder to defend without revision. This means something specific about the founding of every human population outside Africa. Genetic studies have established that all non-African populations trace back to a migration event somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, departing likely from the Horn of Africa or across the Arabian Peninsula. The genetic diversity found across all of Europe, Asia, and the Americas combined is substantially smaller than the diversity present within African populations alone, a direct, measurable scar left by that founding migration. The group that made the crossing was, by current fossil and genetic estimates, as small as 1,000 individuals and likely no larger than 10,000, a group smaller than a modern high school. That is the founding stock of every civilization ever built outside Africa. The Jwalapuram evidence, if confirmed, suggests that the path from near extinction to global colonization was not a single African thread unspooling outward, but possibly a more tangled web, some populations perhaps surviving in South Asian pockets, some in Africa, the genetic signal blurred by the sheer scale of what was lost. Some researchers argue the Jwalapuram toolmakers were anatomically modern humans. Mainstream archaeology disputes this attribution and notes the tools themselves cannot confirm the species of their maker without skeletal remains, which have not been found at the site. What makes this particularly haunting is the arithmetic of the margin. The entire human experiment outside Africa, every language, every city, every written record, every monument visible from space descends from a population that could have gathered in a single field. The Toba event did not have to spare anyone. The ash still visible in sediment cores from the Indian Ocean shows how far the fallout reached. A slightly different wind, a slightly larger eruption, the arithmetic shifts, and the founding group is zero. The ash layer at Jwalapuram is still there, preserved in the sediment beneath the Andhra Pradesh soil, thin and pale and precisely positioned between two sets of tools. The tools are still in storage, still being argued over, their makers still unnamed. What remains unresolved is whether the species edged back from extinction through one refuge or many. and how many times that margin of survival was measured not in thousands of people, but in dozens. Number 6. Homo floresiensis, and the island that kept a secret for an age. In 2003, a joint Australian and Indonesian research team, led by paleoanthropologist Peter Brown of the University of New England, was excavating the floor of Blombos Cave on the island of Flores in Indonesia when a chisel struck something unexpected. The sediment held a skull. It was small, far smaller than any adult human skull had any right to be. The skeleton was that of a fully grown adult. It stood roughly 1 meter tall. The brain cavity was approximately the size of a grapefruit. Radiocarbon and luminescence dating placed the individual at around 50,000 years ago, well within the period when modern humans were already spreading across Southeast Asia. And yet, the bones looked nothing like those of Homo sapiens. The physical evidence is striking in its specifics. The LB1 specimen, as researchers designated it, had a receding forehead, no chin, and arm proportions closer to earlier hominins than to any modern person, preserved in cool, damp cave sediment that held its shape across the millennia. Before 2003, the textbook reading was straightforward. Modern humans and Neanderthals had shared the late Pleistocene world with perhaps 1 or 2 other hominin lineages. But the general expectation was that by 50,000 years ago, the picture had simplified considerably. Flores was not a place where the timeline was supposed to complicate itself. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The research team found not one skeleton, but remains representing at least 9 individuals. And the cave sediment suggested this lineage had persisted on Flores through hundreds of thousands of years of island isolation, long after its nearest continental relatives had vanished from the fossil record. This means the species now designated Homo floresiensis had survived conditions that eliminated far larger populations elsewhere. On the mainland of Java, Homo erectus, a hominin lineage that had endured for nearly 2 million years, appears to have gone extinct somewhere between 108,000 and 117,000 years ago, with researchers including those working at the Ngandong site attributing that disappearance to drought and forest loss rather than direct competition with modern humans. A lineage measured in geological time, gone. Meanwhile, on an island to the east, something small had quietly continued. The parallel with Australia sharpens the point. Around 46,000 years ago, shortly after the first humans arrived on that continent, megafauna that had dominated the landscape for millions of years collapsed almost entirely, a loss that researcher Chris Johnson of the University of Tasmania has connected to that first contact window. Wombat relatives weighing up to 2,700 kilograms disappeared within a few thousand years of human arrival. Large and dominant, they were gone. The Flores hominins, small and isolated, were not. This means isolation, typically understood as a disadvantage, a slow narrowing of the gene pool, a shrinking of possibility, may have functioned here as something closer to a shelter. The edges of the world, cut off from the pressures reshaping the center, sometimes simply outlast it. Mainstream archaeology accepts the basic discovery and the dating. What remains genuinely debated is the precise ancestry of Homo floresiensis. Some researchers argue for a dwarfed descendant of Homo erectus shaped by island conditions over generations, while others propose a more ancient lineage that reached Flores before erectus dominated the mainland. Both readings remain active in the published literature. What makes this particularly haunting is the implication for the broader question of survival at the margins. Every time a lineage nearly vanished and did not pulled back by geography, by accident, by the particular shape of an island, the margin was narrower than the subsequent record suggests. Flores held one such margin in its cave sediment for 50,000 years before anyone looked. Blombos Cave is still there, cut into the limestone of Flores. The bones are still held in research collections, still measured, still argued over by competing phylogenetic models. We still do not know exactly what stood between Homo floresiensis and the extinction that eventually came, only that the island held them when the mainland could not. Number 5. The Adams Event, and the night the sky turned against us. In 2021, paleoecologist Alan Cooper and colleagues at the South Australian Museum were re-examining sediment cores, ice records, and fossil assemblages from across Australia and Europe when the pattern locked into place. The dates aligned, the collapses aligned, and suddenly a geomagnetic anomaly recorded 42,000 years ago looked far less like a footnote in physics and far more like a trigger. The Laschamp geomagnetic excursion is not a myth or a fringe claim. It is documented in ancient lava flows and polar ice cores from multiple continents, a measurable moment when Earth's magnetic field weakened catastrophically, falling to roughly 6% of its present strength. 6%. That number needs a moment to settle. The magnetic shield that deflects charged particles from the sun, that keeps ultraviolet radiation from stripping the upper atmosphere, that makes the surface of this planet habitable rather than hostile, shrank to almost nothing. The result was a dramatic increase in cosmic radiation reaching the ground, documented in elevated carbon-14 levels preserved in ancient kauri trees from New Zealand. Trees whose rings serve as a precise calendar of atmospheric change. Cooper's team named the event the Adams Event, a nod to the science fiction writer Douglas Adams and his concept of catastrophic cosmic coincidence, though the researchers were making a pointed scientific argument, not a literary one. The textbook position before this work treated the Laschamp excursion as a geophysical curiosity interesting to physicists, largely irrelevant to biology. The field wobbled, the field recovered, life continued. That was the comfortable version. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Cooper and colleagues published evidence in 2021 that the Adams Event coincided with the collapse of Australian megafauna populations and, more strikingly, with a dramatic decline in Neanderthal numbers across Europe, a decline from which that population never recovered. Neanderthals had already been coexisting with Homo sapiens for at least 10,000 years before this point, competing, occasionally interbreeding, persisting. Their total population across the entire European continent is estimated to have never exceeded 70,000 individuals at any one time, a number so thin that any sustained pressure, climatic, competitive, radiological, could tip the balance irreversibly. The Adams Event appears to have provided exactly that pressure, or at least to have arrived at the precise worst moment. This means the disappearance of Neanderthals, one of the most debated questions in all of human prehistory, may have had an environmental trigger operating at a planetary scale, not merely a story of one hominin outcompeting another. It also means that Homo sapiens survived something their closest relatives did not, though researchers are careful to note this does not imply immunity, only that the outcome differed. Whether early modern humans possessed behavioral flexibility refugia or simply fortunate geography during peak radiation exposure remains unresolved and actively studied. Mainstream archaeology accepts Cooper's chronological correlation as significant, but continues to debate the causal chain, and other researchers have questioned whether the geomagnetic weakening alone was sufficient to drive megafaunal collapse without additional pressures like human hunting and climate shifts. The truly unsettling aspect is what this implies about the invisible architecture keeping complex life viable on this planet. The magnetic field is not static. It has collapsed before, and, according to geophysical records, it will weaken again. The Adams Event lasted roughly 1,000 years at severely reduced field strength, a duration long enough, the research suggests, to fundamentally reshape which species survived and which did not. Modern humans have never experienced anything like it in recorded history, which means there is no cultural memory, no institutional response, no rehearsal. The kauri tree rings are still preserved in New Zealand, still readable, still carrying their ancient record of a sky that briefly turned hostile. The question of exactly how much the weakened field contributed to Neanderthal extinction versus climate or competition is still genuinely open. What the Adams event leaves behind is not a solved mystery, but a recalibrated understanding of fragility. The recognition that the species standing here today survived a moment when the planet's own defenses nearly failed, and that the margin between survival and the alternative may have been thinner than any fossil record can fully measure. Number 4. Denisovan EPAS1 gene and the mystery inside a finger bone. The problem seemed settled for most of the 20th century. Human evolution moved in a straight line, older species died, newer ones took their place, and the living inherited nothing from the vanquished. Then a fragment of bone arrived that made that story impossible to hold. In 2010, a team led by geneticist Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, was working to reconstruct ancient DNA when a small, curved finger bone from Denisovan cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia yielded something no one had predicted. The bone was no larger than a child's thumbnail. It belonged to a hominin who was neither Neanderthal nor modern human, a third kind of person entirely, now called Denisovan. The physical evidence was almost nothing. One fragment of a fifth finger recovered from a cave system carved into rock above the Anhui River in southern Siberia. No skull, no skeleton. Just that sliver of dense, ancient bone preserved by the cold darkness of a chamber that had sheltered hominins for perhaps 100,000 years. From that fragment, Pääbo's team reconstructed an entire genome, a nearly complete genetic blueprint of a people who had otherwise left almost no trace on the surface of the Earth. The textbook timeline, before this, described Denisovans only as an inference, a ghost population some researchers suspected existed but could not prove. Modern humans, on that account, had walked out of Africa, encountered Neanderthals at the margins, and moved on as sole inheritors of the planet. The idea of a third distinct lineage interbreeding with Homo sapiens in the deep past was considered fringe. The idea that such a lineage's genes might still be shaping living human bodies was not seriously entertained. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Pääbo's sequencing revealed that modern Tibetan highlanders, millions of people living on a plateau averaging more than 4,000 meters above sea level, carry a version of the EPAS1 gene that does not appear in lowland populations anywhere else on Earth. That variant, which allows the human body to use oxygen with remarkable efficiency in thin mountain air, did not evolve independently in Tibetan populations. It was inherited directly from Denisovans, passed forward through interbreeding events that most researchers now place somewhere in Central or East Asia, tens of thousands of years before the first Tibetan civilization left any written record. This means the Denisovans did not simply vanish. They dissolved into the people who came after them, and their biology kept working. A survival trait from a near-extinct sister species is now the reason entire communities of highland farmers, herders, and monastics can live and work and raise children at altitudes that would kill an unacclimatized lowlander within days. The inheritance is not symbolic. It is physiological, active, and measurable in every blood draw from a Tibetan highlander taken today. The same sequencing work confirmed that modern non-African humans carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA, not as a curiosity, but as functional code, including immune-relevant genes that Homo sapiens populations use to recognize and fight pathogens right now in the present century. A separate study published in Nature in 2022 added another layer, reporting that approximately 800,000 years ago, near the close of a severe population bottleneck that had reduced ancestral human numbers to a dangerous low, a chromosomal fusion event joined two ancestral chromosomes into what became human. Chromosome 2, a structural change. Some researchers argue contributed directly to the speciation event that eventually produced Homo sapiens. The truly unsettling aspect is what this chain of events implies about the margin of survival. The lineages feeding into modern humanity were, at various points, each close to extinction. Small populations, isolated ranges, collapsing numbers, and yet their genetic material persisted by merging, not by conquering. The species standing on the planet today is not a clean victor. It is a mosaic, assembled from the remnants of peoples who did not quite make it in any recognizable form. The cave at Denisova is still there, cut into the Altai stone. Its sediment layers holding fragments researchers have not yet fully analyzed. The finger bone that broke the straight line story has been studied down to single base pairs of its ancient code. What remains unresolved is the full map of where Denisovans lived, how many interbreeding events occurred, and how many other traits carried forward in modern bodies still wait to be identified. Fragments of a people who vanished, still breathing inside the living. Number 3. The Younger Dryas, and the cold that almost ended everything. In 1987, geochemist Wallace Broecker of Columbia University was analyzing deep cores of ice drilled from Greenland when he encountered something that stopped the standard climate model in its tracks. The cores held annual layers of compacted snow stretching back more than 100,000 years, and at one particular depth, corresponding to roughly 12,900 years ago, the chemistry changed with a violence that ice should not be capable of recording. The physical evidence was a band of pale, dust-laden ice sandwiched between two warmer periods, thin enough to hold in a hand, yet representing centuries of catastrophic cold. Across the northern hemisphere, pollen records locked inside lake sediments showed forests retreating. Glacial moraines in Scandinavia and Scotland marked where ice sheets pushed back southward. And when researchers measured the oxygen isotope ratios from that Greenland ice, the number they kept arriving at was staggering. In less than a single decade, mean temperatures across the North Atlantic region dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius, a shift larger than the difference between a temperate woodland and the surface of a frozen sea. The textbook story before these cores was orderly. The great ice ages ended, temperatures climbed, and human populations slowly, steadily began domesticating plants and animals. The first farmers of the Fertile Crescent were supposed to have inherited a warming world with time enough to experiment and fail and try again across many comfortable generations. Archaeology in the late 20th century treated the birth of agriculture as gradual, essentially uninterrupted, and climatically fortunate. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Sediment records from Abu Huraira in Syria, a site where early foragers were already harvesting wild rye and einkorn wheat around 12,900 years ago, show that the plant assemblage collapsed almost simultaneously with the temperature signal in the Greenland ice, suggesting those proto-farming communities were struck by climate disruption precisely at the moment they were crossing the threshold into a new way of living, and that many of them turned back. This means the birth of agriculture was not a steady march. It stalled. Some researchers argue it stalled for as long as 1,000 years. The Younger Dryas cold event ran from approximately 12,900 years ago to roughly 11,700 years ago. And across that span, populations in the northern hemisphere shrank, scattered, and in some regions vanished from the archaeological record entirely. Around 12,000 years ago, the great megafauna of North America, mammoths, giant ground sloths, American horses, disappeared from the fossil record, removing the primary prey of Clovis hunters and likely causing regional human population crashes as food networks collapsed. The cause of the Younger Dryas remains actively debated. Geologist James Kennett and his team at the University of California, Santa Barbara, have argued that a cosmic impact or airburst over the Laurentide ice sheet may have triggered the event, pointing to nanodiamond concentrations and platinum anomalies found in sediment layers corresponding to this boundary at more than 50 sites worldwide. This is a serious and contested hypothesis, mainstream researchers dispute whether the impact evidence is sufficiently consistent across all tested sites, and many favor a collapse of cold freshwater outflow from glacial Lake Agassiz disrupting North Atlantic circulation as the primary driver. The debate has not closed. What makes this particularly haunting is that every structure humanity has since built — agriculture, surplus food, settled towns, writing, cities — all of it rests on the accident of what came after, on the 11,000 years of relative climatic stability following the Younger Dryas, a window that in geological terms is barely a breath and that nothing guaranteed would ever arrive. The ice cores are still archived in refrigerated warehouses, still giving up fractions of a degree from layers formed before any human civilization left a named record. The sediment band from Abu Huraira is still measurable, still marking the year a community stopped harvesting wheat and walked away. What remains unresolved is whether the species that now builds satellites and drills kilometers into glaciers to read its own near extinction, whether that species truly understands how narrow the passage was, and how little separates the world it inherited from the silence that almost took its place. Number 2, the Saharan collapse and the desert that made us. The mystery begins not with ruins, but with bones. Hippo bones, dug from the cracked floor of what is now the Central Sahara, hundreds of kilometers from any living river. In 2008, a team led by paleontologist Paul Sereno was excavating a dried lakebed called Gobero in the Tenere Desert of northern Niger, when they uncovered something that stopped the work entirely. Scattered across the pale sediment were human burials, careful, deliberate graves, laid beside the bones of animals that need standing water to survive. Hippos, crocodiles, soft-shelled turtles. The graves were not from a coastal region or a river delta. They were from the middle of the world's largest hot desert at a site that receives almost no rainfall today. The physical evidence at Gobero is staggering in its contradiction. More than 200 individual skeletons were recovered across 2 distinct burial phases, the older dating to roughly 10,000 years ago, and the younger to around 5,000 years ago, with a long gap of abandonment between them that corresponds almost exactly to a period of returned aridity. The bones were well preserved. Some burials showed deliberate poses, a woman and 2 children interred together, arranged facing each other, arms interlaced, as though someone had placed them that way with purpose and grief. Pollen cores and sediment analysis from the lake floor confirmed that Gobero once held open water ringed by savanna, visited by large mammals that cannot exist in desert conditions. That lake is dust now. The broader framework was already known to researchers before Gobero, but the site gave it faces and graves. The Saharan humid period, sometimes called the African humid period, lasted from roughly 11,000 years ago until its end between 5,500 and 4,000 years ago, when the region transformed from a savanna populated by hippos and crocodiles into the hyper-arid barrier the world knows today. The shift was not infinitely slow. Pollen records, lake sediments, and isotope analysis from across North Africa suggest that in some regions the Green Sahara collapsed within a few centuries, possibly faster, drying so completely that millions of people had no realistic option except movement toward the Nile Valley, the Niger, and the Atlantic coast. Before this discovery, the standard interpretation treated early Egyptian civilization as something that developed more or less in place, building gradually from local Nile cultures. The desert around it was assumed to be a near constant backdrop. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The population pressure created by the Saharan collapse appears in the archaeological record of the Nile Valley as a sudden, measurable compression of peoples, tool traditions, and symbolic cultures from an enormous geographic range into a narrow corridor of survival. This means that the foundation event of one of history's most studied civilizations may not have been internal ingenuity alone. It may have been catastrophe arriving from outside, forcing cooperation, density, and hierarchy in ways that a comfortable, dispersed savanna population had no need to develop. The scale of prior isolation makes the pressure even clearer. At the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, the Sahara was not savanna, but a hyper-arid barrier even more impassable than it is today, effectively splitting African human populations into isolated refugia, where groups diverged genetically across thousands of years of separation. Then the rains returned. Populations reconnected, mixed, and spread back across a briefly habitable continent. Then the rains stopped again. The 8.2 kilo-year event occurring around 8,200 years ago delivered a rapid cold snap of approximately 3 degrees Celsius, lasting between 150 and 400 years across the northern hemisphere, triggered by a catastrophic freshwater flood from glacial Lake Agassiz into the North Atlantic. That single pulse disrupted monsoon patterns, stressed Saharan vegetation, and may have sent the first tremors through communities that would eventually collapse entirely 2,000 to 3,000 years later. 3 degrees, 1 flood. A monsoon shifted, and the clock on a green continent began running down. This means the species did not simply build civilization, it was compressed into it, squeezed by a shrinking world into the density needed to produce writing, monumental architecture, and organized agriculture, none of which appear at Gobero, and all of which appear in the Nile Valley shortly after Gobero goes silent. The truly unsettling aspect is that the people buried at Gobero almost certainly did not know what was coming. They returned to the lake when the rains allowed it and laid their dead with care and ceremony in a place they had reason to believe was permanent. The second set of burials ends. The lake bed dries. No third phase of graves appears. The dried lake at Gobero is still there beneath the Tenere sand, still holding those arranged skeletons in their careful, unanswered poses. What remains unresolved is whether the civilization that rose downstream, fed by the pressure of millions displaced from a dying green world, was humanity's greatest adaptation, or simply the shape that survival takes when there is nowhere left to go. Number 1. The 900,000-year bottleneck, and the math is merciless. The mystery was always this: how thin was the thread? Not the thread of one culture, or one migration, or one drought. The thread of the entire human lineage itself, the unbroken biological chain that connects every person who has ever lived to a single, catastrophically small group of ancestors clinging to survival on an ancient African landscape. In 2021, geneticist Wang Jiehu and a team of colleagues at the Shanghai Institute of Nutrition and Health were analyzing modern human genome sequences when the signal appeared in the data. They were not digging in soil. They were reading the accumulated record of survival and death written inside living DNA, a record that ancient populations left behind in the form of inherited variation, like rings in a tree that remember every drought. What the data showed stopped the team cold. The number was 1,280. Not 1,280 settlements or 1,280 tools recovered from a trench. Not 1,280 burial sites scattered across a continent. The calculated number of breeding individuals, the entire reproductive population of the hominin lineage that would eventually become Homo sapiens, had collapsed to approximately 1,280 people, a group that would fill a modest village hall, a crowd that could fit inside a single large building. That was all of humanity, at its lowest recorded point, approximately 900,000 years ago. The textbook timeline before this study acknowledged periods of hardship in early human prehistory, but it offered no precise mechanism for a catastrophic, near-total collapse of this magnitude at this date. Standard models described a species spreading, adapting, diversifying. not one teetering at the biological edge of non-existence for an almost incomprehensible span of time. The 900,000-year bottleneck, as Hu's team calculated it, lasted approximately 117,000 years, meaning that the ancestral human population persisted at near-extinction density for a duration longer than the entire sweep of recorded civilization multiplied many times over. The evidence for this conclusion came from a technique called fit-col, a mathematical model applied to genome data from present-day populations across multiple continents, allowing researchers to reconstruct ancestral population sizes far deeper into the past than earlier methods permitted. The genetic signatures of that collapse are still present in every human alive, today embedded in the reduced variation of the genome itself. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Because the bottleneck did not occur in an environmental vacuum, and the timing is not coincidental. Year periodicity producing longer, deeper. The 900,000-year threshold coincides almost exactly with one of the most significant climate transitions in Earth's recent geological history, the moment when glacial cycles shifted from a 41,000 to a 100,000-year periodicity more devastating ice ages that restructured rainfall, vegetation, and food availability across the African continent and beyond. The climate did not just change. It changed the rules, and the ancestral human lineage very nearly did not survive the new terms. This means the bottleneck was almost certainly not a single event, but a prolonged ordeal, a grinding attrition across dozens of generations in which most family lines simply ended, leaving no descendants and no trace except an absence. A gap in the genetic record that Hu's team calculated represented the loss of approximately 65.85% of all ancestral human genetic diversity. That variation is gone permanently. No recovery is possible. The human genome today is narrower, less varied, more constrained than it would have been had those 117,000 years unfolded differently. And mainstream science does not dispute the core finding, though some researchers argue the precise population floor and duration require further verification against additional genomic datasets. The implication is not subtle. The species did not thrive its way to dominance. It survived barely by a margin that should not have held. Every subsequent development, the stone tool traditions, the coastal migrations, the cave paintings, the cities, the written languages, the entire recorded span of human achievement rests on the improbable persistence of fewer than 1,300 people through more than 100,000 years of climate catastrophe. We are not the inevitable crown of a robust lineage. The evidence, as Hu's team read it, describes something closer to a residue. What makes this particularly haunting is that the bottleneck answers the through-line question of this entire list with devastating simplicity. Every earlier entry, the displaced populations, the vanished green landscapes, the rearranged bones, the flooded coastlines, all of it describes a species that has been, repeatedly and without sentimentality, nearly erased by the forces it did not control and could not predict. The fragility visible in every one of those episodes is not a series of isolated close calls. It is a pattern. And the pattern reaches all the way back to a moment 900,000 years ago, when the margin was 1,280 people and a shifting climate that had no interest in the outcome. The genome is still carrying that scar encoded in every cell of every living human being on the planet. The African landscape, where those 1,280 individuals endured, still exists beneath younger geology, unreachable and unnamed. We still do not know what allowed that remnant group to hold on when every pressure of the age was pushing towards zero, and whether whatever quality preserved them then is the same fragile thread that persists now. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.